So I got a message from my next door neighbor that they'd cut down trees, blocked all the entrances to my farm, and there were about 60 of them coming. Well, that happened all night. We phoned the police, I don't know, many times. My sister in Harare got hold of diplomatic people, and there was nothing that could be done.
At 4 o'clock when I drove out the gate, money I had in my pocket was the last money I would ever earn from my investment again.
I never got onto the farm because it was taken.
At about 5 o'clock in the morning, they started macheting down my doors. By that time, I'd retreated into my bedroom. I was teaching my wife how to use weapons. Sorry. I thought that was the end. I then phoned the police and I said, listen, I've got 300 rounds here. I've counted the guys outside. There are 60 of them there. You better start bringing body bags.
My name is Willie Spies. I'm an attorney and I've been involved with the Zimbabwean farmers and their struggle to restore the rule of law for more than 15 years. 23 years ago, the rule of law made room for the rule of man in Zimbabwe. The right to property and the right of your property to be protected made room for so-called expropriation without compensation in the name of redistribution. The result of that was devastating. Farmers were chased off, farmers were attacked, brutalized, their farm workers were chased off the farms, they lost their jobs, they ended up in poverty, and the entire Zimbabwean population went into diaspora all over the world.
My name is Trevor Gifford. I'm a third-generation Zimbabwean. I used to farm in Chipinge in the southeastern highlands of Zimbabwe. It was a farm that's been in the family since 1894. My great-grandfather started the farm even before there was a proper international boundary between Zimbabwe and Mozambique.
I'm Rusty Markham. I'm a Member of Parliament in Zimbabwe for Harare North. I am an ex-farmer.
My name is Wynand Hart. I started farming in Kadoma in the Mashonaland West area of Zimbabwe in 1978, working for my father on the farm, and then progressed from there and started leasing the farm in 1983 from him. From there I progressed to buying my own farm in 1995 with a certificate of no interest from the government. In other words, they declared that they were not interested in that farm and that I could buy it. Then in 1997, November 1997, the farm was listed for expropriation for the first time. Of course, then, because we had invested all our money in it, I actually was in a company with my brother-in-law, Jos de Toy, and he was doing the cropping and cattle, Bonsmara stud, and I was doing the wildlife on the property. And because we'd invested all our monies, we then went to court and objected to the listing for expropriation, which the listing was actually reversed officially by the court. However, in 2001, 21st of August 2001, we were then invaded by invaders and who forcibly forced us off the farm.
Mike Woodendall, farmed in the Chipinge area, Gosland province of Zim. We had 5 farms and we had 700 head of beef cattle, milked 140 head of dairy cattle, grew coffee, burley tobacco, burplurum flowers, and also macadamias. In the spirit of land reform, we as a family donated 1 farm to government, providing as a South African citizen they would leave us alone. That wasn't adhered to, and they took that farm, and I said providing they paid us as well and left us alone. They didn't pay us, they didn't leave us alone. And then from 2002 to 2008, they took each individual farm on a different basis through those years. It was all through using their militia to get us off the farms. And the one farm had a brilliant coffee plantation on, and that a year later became obsolete. They just had maize there, and coffee was a big export crop at that stage. And each farm was done differently, and eventually we were left with the dairy farm, which was meant to be strategic to Zimbabwe and the economy.
I started farming back on the family farm, which had been pretty idle from 1978 until April 1990 when I started. And basically from that time until I lost the farm finally, I developed it from nothing to a farm that had 250 hectares of coffee, 500 hectares of eucalyptus, 250 hectares of macadamias, 60 hectares of avocado, 120 cow dairy herd, and I employed at peak up to 1,200 people.
Where your farm title was your collateral at the bank, your banks immediately close you down. So in other words, I did not have the opportunity for a loan or anything like that. Despite my good track record, the title deeds in Zimbabwe completely became worthless. So I became a nobody. I didn't have the ability to look after my family.
Unfortunately, I was viewed as a political activist, even though some of my friends were high up in the Zimbabwean government, like the late vice president was a friend of mine, the ex-minister of security was a friend of mine. But suddenly, because of my color and my not agreeing with their policies, I became enemy number one, to such an extent that I had 3 hit squads put onto me.
The house, when I eventually got back into the court order, there was nothing left. It was just the gun cabinet.
The legal battle started off in Zimbabwe itself with a couple of courageous farmers who decided they do have rights and they are going to protect those rights by approaching the courts. So back in Zimbabwe, an organization known as Justice for Agriculture was established. They embarked on a whole range of court cases in Zimbabwe itself. But unfortunately, at the end, the Zimbabwean government started to dismantle every piece of law that existed. So the Constitution of Zimbabwe was amended retrospectively. The entire bench of the Supreme Court of Zimbabwe was replaced with political puppets. And the end result of it was that the rule of law in Zimbabwe itself was totally destroyed. The fighters for justice in Zimbabwe then approached the SADC Tribunal, which is a regional court with jurisdiction in the entire SADC region, consisting of 14 countries, of which South Africa and Zimbabwe are also members. The SADC Tribunal had jurisdiction to adjudicate human rights abuses as well. And in 2008, 78 farmers approached the SADC Tribunal, and they succeeded. For the very first time in Africa, a regional human rights court decided that the land redistribution program in Zimbabwe was racist, that it was infringing upon the human rights of Zimbabwean people, and that it had to be overturned, and that proper compensation had to be paid for farmers. Unfortunately, it didn't end there. The Zimbabwean government just disregarded this ruling. We got involved and we started with a process to enforce the ruling in South Africa. We approached the South African High Courts. We managed to register the court ruling, or the ruling of the SADC Tribunal here. We even managed to attach a property of the Zimbabwean government in Cape Town, in Kenilworth, Cape Town, and we sold it on a public auction, which is probably the very first time that a human rights decision by a human rights court has been enforced by a sale of execution of government property in a neighboring country. The Zimbabwean government didn't sit still. They literally conspired with the other SADC leaders. President Zuma was in power a year back then, and in what the Constitutional Court later framed as a well-planned conspiracy, they dismantled the SADC Tribunal. And the end result of it was that the regional enforcer of the rule of law for this Southern African region has been destroyed by what we refer to as the rule of man.
In Parliament, I've raised the issue for indigenous farmers more often than I've raised it for what is termed former farm owners, which is a euphemism for white commercial farmers. There are, by admission of the Minister of Agriculture, 650 indigenous farmers have been kicked off their land, and I would presume that is mostly because of their political belief. And my reason is, if the whole government propaganda is about we fought for the land, why did you kick 650 people off their land with no compensation? Now, the issue of the racialism still stands because the global settlement deed ostensibly deals with white farmers. The government themselves issued the statutory instrument 62 of 2020, which covered indigenous farmers and BIPA. BIPA was the investment license that covered foreign investors. And they basically have been told they will get their farms back with a 99-year lease. Well, not one has been issued. I've asked that question numerous times in Parliament, and they have never been able to give me one name of one person who's had a 99-year lease, and that has been rolling for about 7 years. And that the indigenous farmer is actually finding himself in a worse position than we are.
The global compensation deed as it stands now, the initial offer was that it would be payment of 50% of a global figure of 3.5 billion, which was a depreciated value by negotiation. Whereas the initial valuation was done by law, Zimbabwe law. They rejected that right that we had as farmers to be paid that amount that was determined by law and a legal process, and negotiated it downwards because they found it acceptable to pay less for that. Now, the 3.5 billion would have been paid 50% the first year and the rest of the other 50% over the next 4 years. So that within 5 years, everything would be paid out. That was the main reason why what the negotiators told us for the devaluation of that amount. It did not include the value of land. However, you then had to submit your right to any other action or legal rights or claims and anything else except for what was agreed in the deed. In other words, if you became mute, you had to accept what you were offered. You were a beggar. And the way of payment was, as I said, structured in that. Subsequent to that, they failed in raising the money. Then they offered a 20-year bond payment, which was unacceptable to the farmers and turned down by the farmers because it's really a 20-year promise of nothing. And then they came with a third offer now that is a 10-year bond offer, which is a 10-year promise of nothing, which is all unacceptable to us. So not only did they destroy our rights, our property right, they want now us to agree to withdraw from the right to full and fair compensation. And the reason why I'm here today is because I see the avenue of engagement is not through the domestic environment inside Zimbabwe, which is completely toxic. It is through the international environment, where we have allies, where we have rights that have been clearly established by our legal actions over the years.
The proposal that was put on the table didn't go far enough because it didn't sort out the underlying problems. And it's one thing to compensate, but we need to ensure that we sort out the road for future generations. And this agreement that's been tabled does not do that.
If they resolve this issue and got the land back to proper production, Zimbabwe would go forward. But they are stagnating it through one form or another. And if they did that, Zimbabwe would fly. But what's happening now, they're not paying us compensation for our own improvements. According to their own constitution, they pay us, and they keep diminishing the numbers.
So when I looked at my valuation and like I'm farming now in Zambia, I looked at what it cost me to develop the irrigation, etc., and it was a paltry amount. It was probably 50% of what I thought was a fair compensation. So when they put that on the table, the only thing that attracted me, that they would pay me allegedly a bullet payment in foreign currency in a bank account of your choice with no deductions. Well, when we looked into that, after I'd voted no, because one, I didn't feel the compensation was correct. When I looked at what was happening there, I started speaking to accountants, to lawyers, and it was almost like it was a wishy-washy carrot that had been dangled in front of us. For example, the offshore payment is illegal in Zimbabwean law. Whether it's the Minister of Justice or the Minister of Finance who has to table an SI, an instrument, to allow us to be paid. In the 2.5 years, that hasn't been done. So that shows you that there's no way that they wanted to honor that agreement. I feel that and subsequently there was another 20-year agreement that came out just recently, the bond coupon was 1%. America's just launched a coupon for 4%. No one took it. So they expect us to take a 1% on the Zimbabwean. We've got no property rights. So how are they going to secure those bonds? It's impossible. So as far as I'm concerned, it's a non-starter. Like you maybe heard inside there, if my kids can benefit from my title, maybe one of them will go back farming. But I'm not giving away my title. I've got a little document here, which was from what was called Shamva Glimpses of the Past, and an old lady wrote this. And there's a story of my grandmother in 1915 riding her horse to school. So, it's just amazing how long we've been there and in that specific area. And we're still deemed to be non-indigenous. My blood's red just like everyone else's. My heart is in the country just like everyone else's. But I'm afraid I'm persona non grata. Like the ex-governor told one of our Farmers Association chairman, Graham will never farm here again. He's politically and socially unacceptable, just for my beliefs in the rule of law and the goodness for the people.
That a white Zimbabwean cannot own land is fundamentally wrong, and there's something we can do about that. The Zimbabwean government has to do something about that. Zimbabwe used to be the envy of the world's cattle industry. It had very little competition internationally. It was the envy of the world's cotton industry. The Zimbabwean farmers were the kings of the tobacco industry. They were under the 5 top producers of cut flowers. And nothing has changed in nature. They can be that again. That country can turn on a tiki. Everything is still there. What lacks is a policy environment that is conducive to this country to get back onto its feet again. To get there, we need to turn on the pressure. And it is very clear what the end game should be. At the end, we need fair compensation for the farmers and restitution for those who wish to go back to farm again. Zimbabwe needs those farmers, every one of them. And we need equal citizenship. This is the only way Zimbabwe will be open for investment again. Investment without which this country will not be able to return to its full potential to be a breadbasket in Southern Africa.